The book is Focal Point, Guide to Running Sessions. The writers are the brain trust of Gnome Stew and Engine Publishing, Phil Vecchione, Walt Kanowski, and John Arcadian. Welcome to Threats from Gallifrey, folks.
Howdy.
Good evening.
Hello.
Excellent. So let's start right at the beginning. I mean, who is this book targeted for? What levels of experience and GMing are in here? Is this can newbies get something out as much as veterans, or what's the breakdown, for your target audience on this?
Anybody want to grab that?
So one of the things to state about how we wrote the book was that we each took it and took a section and had 3 different sections, and each kind of crafted our sections ourselves, and then had feedback back and forth through it. So we definitely have kind of 3 distinct voices in the book. But I think by and large, all of us kind of aimed it towards a kind of like making sure there was stuff there that was good for people who weren't, who were just stepping into the role of GMing, but also tried to make stuff that was there for people who, had been around the GM screen a couple of times and were looking to say, well, what else haven't I thought of? What else could I do? I know I always try to write with that kind of balance of, if somebody new is picking up this book, could I give them good advice, but also have them come back to it and take a look, 3 years from their first game and say, oh, that's awesome. I wasn't thinking about that. Now I can incorporate those sorts of things into my game.
And then using the 3-pronged approach, I mean, it's also good for game masters that have been around a while that maybe are, find themselves weaker in a particular prong. I know that I learned a lot reading John's chapter, especially because I'm not really a props guy when I, run the table.
Yeah, I mean, our the idea was that when it comes to the 3 prongs, which is entertainer, storyteller, and facilitator, that there are some things that you'll do very well. So one of them you'll be very good at, one of them you'll be pretty good at, and one of them will be your weaker one. And the idea was that this book kind of then helps to raise up your weaker skills. So it really is something that a new GM could take, save themselves the challenges of having to run all those failed games that we ran in the past, and benefit from our knowledge. Or if you're an experienced GM, it's the kind of book that as you go through, you think, oh yeah, I know that. Oh, that's something I don't do. I should try doing that.
I really liked your point there, Walt. What did you guys learn from the other guys' chapters that really stuck with you?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll go first. With John, just basically just using props in general. It is definitely something that I do not do. I'm the kind of game master who doesn't even like to use miniatures. So, but in reading through his, it really stuck with me that having that physical element for the players can really help enhance the mood of a session. Phil, he's just, I mean, he always has been far more prepared than I am. Yeah, there's a plug for your earlier book there, Phil.
Thank you.
You can get Phil's book Far More Prepared.
Far more, never unprepared.
Mm-hmm. With Phil, it is neat to read about him talking about things like being improv ready and stuff, because it's not something that was probably in his wheelhouse a little while, not too long ago. But it's interesting to see how we've all changed over time. I've known this for far too long now.
I would say for me, probably most of John's chapter, because like Walt, I'm not a good prop guy, but actually what really got me in John's chapter was talking about just the way you use speech at the table, the way, like, the cadence of your voice and the way you present things is just as potent as making a cool prop to put out on the table. And for Walt, the thing I really learned, because I don't really use prepared material. I just pretty much write my own stuff. And Walt talks about, he has a whole chapter about how to take published material go through it and work it up so that it's ready for you to run. And that is a skill that I actually don't have because I just rely on writing my own stuff.
Yeah, my section is easy to pull from because I'm pretty much just playing with toys and telling you how you can play with toys at the gaming table. So that's easy to glom onto and say this is going to be awesome way to bring something physical into it. But I really appreciated reading through Phil and Walt's, which I had to do in depth because I was also art director for the book. And one of the things that Walt does very well, he writes a lot of stuff and a lot of published material for a lot of companies and a lot of adventures. So he would submit these like flowcharts of how adventure prep can be or how you can modify that. And I would look at all these flowcharts and be like, okay, well, how am I going to write that and get that to fit in there? And how am I going to work with the graphic designer and be like, yeah, this will work in there. But then I'm also looking over and going, damn, I never think about that. I never think about that because I am such an improv-heavy GM, and I do focus on more tangible, more visceral bits. I'm like, but I should really think about this flow more in depth before I get to the table. And then with Phil covers a wide variety of topics, but the one that always catches me is his use of safety in the X card, pulling in that stuff because I'm thinking about how to make every player feel comfortable at the table, but rarely in such distinct terms as Phil brings up in this chapter. And that's something that's really neat about the way this book, which tackles these kind of distinct areas, is we think about safety in a very focused way. Well, you might think, oh yeah, I should think about that. It gets talked about so in depth it can't help but bring up other ideas and make you really look at it and consider it from your own perspective.
It's one thing to bring this book to the attention, of new GMs, and there's tons and tons of new ones luckily coming in. But how do you address the GM who's been doing this for over 20 years, who's got his style down and is locked down? But I always find, the same with television shows and stuff, if you don't reinvent yourself every 4 years, you go stagnant. How do you present this book to veteran GMs who feel very established on this, but really could benefit a lot from this material?
Yeah, I think that as a GM, you're always growing because you're always affected by the different games you're playing, the different people you play with, the different style, the different genres and things like that. So, I mean, maybe this is just me, or maybe it's the fact that 7 years of writing GMing advice. I feel like everybody should be on a journey, but I feel like the GM I was when I was in the 90s running Vampire and the GM I am today running Fate, they're not the same person. I mean, so there's been this constant growth and evolution, maturity, or whatever. And so I would encourage established GMs, even if you're completely comfortable and you've got your style down and you can, you run your, favorite game and you've got it nailed down, I would move a little out of your comfort zone and try something different and push yourself in a direction that you're not quite comfortable with. You may find that there are things that you're not doing that you really would enjoy if you just kind of move past the area of comfort.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chuck.
After you.
All right, fine. No. One thing that I would say, I mean, obviously, I've been GMing since, I don't know, I was 9 or 10, and I still get a kick out of reading GM advice books because there's always a couple of things that I'll read about and I'll just be like, oh, I never thought about it that way, and then incorporate it in my style, and then you evolve, you move on. The other thing is, I mean, I've put some of this in my chapters over the last few years. I started GMing convention games more, and running convention games requires oftentimes a completely different mindset than what you're used to. Because you're walking in. There's a group of strangers. It's not your usual group. It's not your usual flow, and you've got to adapt. And you've got different goals now, and different ways you have to approach an adventure. And even with established game masters, I mean, your group could change overnight on you. And what works with half your group for the last 3 years, all of a sudden may not work anymore. And maybe some of the tips in here can help you, bridge that gap.
One of the strongest ways that I think we connect with longtime GMs is in the way we begin and end each section, each chapter, with story vignettes that come from the perspective of this group of a GM and her players that have been together for a long time. So we kind of write up this scenario that we're trying to address, and then we answer how the advice in the chapter helped it, at the end, showing kind of like, often made up scenarios, but of course pulled from our experiences. So as we're writing like Gemma and Adam and Patty and Ronaldo sitting there and trying to figure out and navigate these issues, we're pulling from our own experiences. And when I look over and read, Walt and Phil's, and then even my own, like months after I wrote it, I go, oh yeah, that's just like a time that I had that I was thinking, oh hey, cool, I never thought about this in those terms. So I think that really kind of, helps an established GM who's like, oh yeah, I've been around the block a few times, to sit there and see themselves in these scenarios, and then when they go through and read the advice or read our suggestions for handling different types of scenarios or situations, they kind of see different ways to handle and tackle them, because they've kind of opened themselves up to it because they can see themselves in there.
And just to add one final point, one thing I learned in Odyssey, a lot of the feedback I got, especially from my sections, is that people who were reading it, appreciated that I wasn't afraid to put in, the places where I've screwed up along the way. And, even now, I've been game mastering GIs for God knows how long at this point. I still make mistakes, and there are still things you can learn from, and there are still things where I on the car ride home from the session where I'm like, oh, I could have approached this differently. So, some of that self-deprecating stuff made it into this book, obviously.
One of my favorite things. Oh, go ahead, Phil.
I was just gonna say jokingly that actually I think all three of these books, Never Unprepared, Odyssey, and Focal Point, have been built on the bones of many a dead game. That's
But something good came of them.
Yes.
I mean, they always say hindsight is 20/20, and I know whenever I'm writing articles for Gnome Stewer and this, almost everything comes from like, man, I wish I had done that better. If only I'd done that this way, or the way I saw that guy handle that situation better. Yeah. So I think definitely our failures definitely drive us to write a lot of good advice in here as to how things could be handled.
One of the things I was thinking about listening to you guys was one of the things I always like to do for the last few years at conventions is to find a GM who's got the crowd completely riveted and sit down and watch what he's doing and just study the GMs. And I keep overbooking myself now at cons, so I don't do that as much. But do you guys do that? Do you have like GMs that you like to watch when you go to conventions or actual play things online and stuff? And if so, who would you recommend that people watch to see masters in action?
One thing I often do a similar thing, like when I'm sitting there and running my game or playing in a game, if there is another game in the room that seems to be just filled with laughter, everybody is engaged, everybody's enjoying it, everybody is talking back and forth, when there's a break, I will go over to that GM and say, hey, your game sounds cool, what are you running, what's this like, where do I find something else by you on the schedule? And more often than not, I find those things are filled up, because people keep going back to those GMs or hear about that, but yeah, I mean, everybody has a slightly different style to run, but at conventions, things that the best kind of seems to rise to the top. People try to bring their best, So I think you can learn a lot from watching other GMs at conventions. And I think you just have to look for whatever groups are the most engaged and try to like grab in there onto whatever next game that GM might have open.
Go watch.
I was just going to ask John, is there any actual play or YouTube videos that you've seen of legendary GMing that you can recommend to our viewers?
A lot of the YouTube videos that I have seen generally tend to be the, like, here's this concept for this game that was hugely over the top. Like, I'm going to run this with 25 people, or, of course, like, the Tracy Hickman Killer Breakfast sort of thing. Like, I think it is kind of hard to find, like, a good core example of like core game running. But of course, every game's a little different. Every game has a slightly different style. One who I had mentioned, who of course Rick and Phil know, is a friend of mine who goes by the Doctor and is a head ringer for the Ninth Doctor, who brings out his giant TARDIS, sets it on the front, begins, has everything, just runs and just has energy the entire time, and engages everybody. I think in the last one at Origins, he had a player playing Strax running around in a pink princess dress doing military marching, and had them get up and encourage them to get up and march around the table, which of course everybody in the room's like, what's going on over there, So yeah, that is a good one that I can think of off the top of my head, but YouTube videos are hard to find something that's not a little gimmicky or over the top to begin with.
Yeah. Well, you were going to say?
I was just going to say, going to say, come watch John when he's running something. I had him running the One Ring for us for Cubicle 7, and especially the one with that orc. I mean, that was great. The guy who showed up in full cosplay garb, and John pulled him aside and asked him if he wanted to play the bad guys, and completely adjusted the adventure on the fly. I mean, that was just awesome.
And that guy did total PvP versus his friends. And to be fair, all those games I bribed them with beer, which was actually iced tea, but they walked down to character sheets with on top of giant beer steins, so that when they started in the feasting hall, they had like the steins that were lifting them and drinking and feasting. So that started them off already on the, all right, we're going to go over the top with this right from the get-go.
Yeah, and the other one, the Doctor. I mean, he was a lot of fun, and I actually, this is sort of tangential, but I wrote the Doctor Who event for Origins and Gen Con this year. So I asked him if I could sit in one night and just watch, because I wanted to see if the way I was writing was helpful to another GM, or if I needed to adjust anything. And it was really interesting to see what he was doing with the material. And I mean, his groups always had a blast. So
what did you learn from that session?
That I write 5-hour adventures for 4-hour slots. But no, it is actually interesting to see. Whenever I write an adventure, I tend to put in. I think I might have touched on this, and I'm sure I touched on this. Sort of like the optional scenes and the core scenes that you have to have in an adventure. And I try to load those in. I always feel like, especially for convention adventures, it's better to give a game master more material than less. And it's interesting to see what gets considered a core scene versus an optional scene, and how that changes based on how the players are reacting to the game. So yeah, I mean, I learned that I throw a lot of information out at my GMs. Some of them appreciate it, some of them not so much. I know, John, were you the one? Was the One Ring like a 43-page adventure or something?
Yeah, I got the because that was kind of a last-minute thing. I got the just full adventure right from the book that has not yet been published and thus cannot yet be named. But it was like, all right, so there's all this stuff with cards, and there's all this stuff with how this culture does this. Red line gone. Red line gone. All right, here's what I'm doing. And I think I ditched most of that on the fly, but I would completely agree with you, Walt. Like, it is better as a GM to have stuff that I can ignore than to be sitting there having to like fumble for something out of the blue and not know what to do. I can always change stuff on the fly at the table. I can't, it's harder to make it up from scratch than to say, well, this character's actually a witch. Yeah, I know she's the main like interest that you're supposed to be protecting, but now she's the villain. Done. All right, I can wing that.
And I could say at Gen Con, we were running Lone Wolf for the first time. And I had a couple of GMs running it. One was more inexperienced. The other one had a lot of experience. It was Ange, Angela, you guys know her. She's one of our gnomes. And the first time the inexperienced one ran it, the adventure was over in like 2 hours in a 4-hour slot. And she happened to sit in and watch Angela and how Angela had adapted the adventure. And that pushed it to the 4-hour mark. It was just a quick fix. She basically just changed one encounter to have a monster there instead of an animal or something that they were saving. So she incorporated that on the fly into her adventures, and the other events ran a lot better for her. So I mean, most GMs, if you watch, you can always glean something because every GM is a little different.
Very cool. And Phil?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm going to second Walt about John because there's a time I played with John where he had, I think it was just like butcher paper or something on the table, and there's like 6 people. I'm one of the 6 people, and he says, all right, everybody just name like one thing you want to see in the adventure. And he wrote them down on the paper, and then he just started the adventure, and over the course of a couple hours, he just crossed off each one as he worked each element into the game, and I thought that was pretty impressive. That's sourcing the table for specific elements and working them in on the fly. And then, I mean, locally, like, so first of all, Garrett, I've seen your table with like a full AT-AT. I mean, I've seen the stuff you run at Queen City Conquest when we game locally, and your table is very impressive, and you always have a full table of people playing. In fact, I think it was a year or two ago that it was a Sunday morning and you were running Toon. Yeah. And it was outrageous how that table was hooting and hollering and everything else during the course of the game. And then we're fortunate. There are a number of other local GMs around here. Chris Sneezak is excellent. He's very good improv GM. Tim Hannon, another Mr. Savage Worlds. His stuff is always sharp, and he's got such great system mastery over that game that he makes it fun. If you've never played Savage Worlds, you can just sit down and Tim will get you right through a whole game, and you'll have a blast.
I'm so glad those are the 2 you named because those are the 2 people I picked to help me run the 18-player Deadlands Delve I'm doing at Queen City.
Yeah, it's good. You picked 2 heavy hitters.
Is that the Buffalo Con?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I'm still deciding whether I want to go.
You want to go because John's going to be there.
I'm going to go. Hey, Andy Hop has has part of a room available. I know you could share with Andy, and that will be a treat and a half.
I've got my wife's uncle lives in Buffalo, so
cool.
Yeah, you want to go.
Of course you want to go. And you want to play an 18-player Deadlands game at the Battle for Washington, D.C.
What time is that? Because
It's Saturday evening.
Cool. I may jump into that then.
All right, cool.
What's evening?
Oh, I don't know. I think it's like 7 to 11.
7 to 11 is the last slot for the.
I start turning into a pumpkin by like 10. I'm an old guy.
Kind of in a related question about when I was talking about stagnation and thing. So what if you about kind of the flip side on this? You've gamed with the group. My Sunday group. I've gamed with these guys for 18 years now. I know what they're going to do, and when I GM, a lot of the times they know what I'm going to do. What advice do you have for shaking things up? What parts of the books do you recommend for people to go through so that they can mix things up to surprise their parties again and make things anew for the group?
I like that. I'm gonna say that the chapters on improvisation. So I think I have one, chapter 17 on improvising lines, and I think Walt, you have a chapter also about kind of sourcing the table and adjusting the game on the fly. Like, I think that's the best way when you've been playing with a group of people for a while, and you want to change it up. You take advantage of the fact that you have a good connection with these people, but at the same time you kind of relinquish control of the game. Like, you relinquish more control of the game out to the group and let the group kind of source and collaborate together on what the game's really going to be about. And you do that by, like, sitting down and just seeding out questions like, hey, you're in a bar and this guy's got a gun in your face. Who is that guy? Why is he looking to blow you away? And just start from there and let everybody play off of everyone.
Yeah, Walt's, I think it's the Keep Filming chapter, has a lot of stuff on, like, here's how you keep stuff moving, here's how you keep stuff going, that is great to kind of, like, grab and say, oh, I could apply that to keeping, to trying to keep this from going to a stagnant place, Of course, like you say, with a group of 18 years, you've got all the same jokes when, like in my group, if I say, so, everybody makes a little sewing motion because they're all used to that. They all have those jokes. Or when I say roll, they do that beautiful bean footage. And one of the things that I like to do is I force other people to run games. I'm like, all right, I'm going to take a month break. Who's running the next game? Because otherwise we're going to start playing this, and then somebody gets another different game going, and we have a little bit different of a style, or we've kind of instituted a rule of whatever the next game is that we're going to do is going to be something vastly different. Like if we've been playing a lot of D&D, we're going to go run a 2 to 3 one-shots of Fiasco or Apocalypse World or Burning Wheel or something that has a different vibe to it that gives us a different sense of play. And then if inevitably we go back to some of our old favorites, what we're comfortable with, but then we have like, ooh, you know what? I want to do something more like this because that was fun when I ran that kind of game. I want to include some of that feeling into this current game.
Yeah, I would also say, sort of to combine me and Phil. I mean, when you have the lunch break, that's a good time to come up with an improv, because if your group knows you too well and you think that the session is getting going down the predetermined path, so to speak, because your players know you and you know your players, just come up with something fun that you have no plans for and just toss it in for the back end of the session, because if you don't know where you're going, they don't know either.
Exactly.
And you'll have plenty of time between sessions to turn it into something with whatever direction they ran with the ball. But at that point, you're not really worried about making your goals, because chances are the players have hunted that down anyway. So it's a good opportunity to just go ahead and just toss something in, improv, and just like I said, just let them play with it.
I think I read somewhere recently that Tolkien admitted that while he was writing Lord of the Rings, he had no idea completely where it was going. Is that the great secret of writing and game mastering, that you don't have to know where the road goes?
Oh, I would say absolutely so.
Well,
I wouldn't have said that. I wouldn't have said that a few years ago, but I am much more inclined to say that today.
I always know where the road is going. But
43 pages.
I mean, in convention games, you will know, because in a convention setting, 9 times out of 10, the players at the table are going to look to you for direction. They're not usually looking to wander, unless it's one of John's games. They're not usually looking to come in and completely derail things. And with my own groups, after a while, you kind of get an intuition of where they're heading. So I always think it's good to have an end goal in mind, just as long as you're not afraid to change it based on how things are going at the table. But I do like to have. I mean, I write in the industry, and there's no better moment for me in the middle of writing when I can finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. Because in the beginning, a lot of times when you're on a project, you're not entirely sure what it's going to look like. And there's something satisfying getting to that point going, oh, okay, this is where we're heading. And, even if you need to change it up later, it's still, I think it's good to have a sort of guidepost along the way.
Very cool.
I think it's important. It's useful to have a road map so you can deviate from it. If you're like, yes, here I have an idea of where this is going to go, even if these are incredibly loosely defined boundaries. I think it's even more important for the players to believe that you have a roadmap, whether you have zero clue or not. And even that, like, I'm going to improv a lot of stuff. That's kind of what my players know from me, but I always act with confidence about it. Like, no, I will figure out where this is going. Even if I don't say, I will never say I have no idea where this is going. I say, I will figure it out. Or, I kind of have a general idea, but I see how their ideas or what they're excited about modifies that. And if one of them gives me a better idea, says like, I don't know, that princess is acting kind of sketchy. And I'm like, you noticed that, eh? Of course she is. Give me a roll to see if you can determine why. Why is she acting sketchy? Oh, because of this. And, kind of figure it out there and then see how that works into whatever overarching plot I may be envisioning, or if I need to change that overarching plot.
Cool. Phil, you said earlier that you realized that the world of game mastering is ever going on journey. Do you remember when in your game mastering career you realized that there was no end to this road, that your skills would keep on growing and growing? Do you remember when that realization set into you, or whereabouts in your career that was?
I think it's like, year 3 of writing for Gnome Stew, realizing I hadn't run out of material yet. I just assumed at some point when we all started writing at Gnome Stew, I was like, oh, I'll probably at some point just use up everything I know about game mastering, in the first couple years, and find something else to do. And then I realized, like, I just over time, there was always something coming up at a table. There was always something going on. And then even now, if I go back and look at my older articles, I can see the difference in what games were influencing me, what style of game mastering I was using or being influenced by. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, jokingly, I mentioned the blog. I think the first time I really noticed it was back in the '90s when I ran my first game of Amber Diceless, and that kind of just kind of blew my mind about how GMing worked, because it's diceless and it's barely got a rule set, and you're basically holding the whole campaign in your hands and making it go forward. And it was so different from anything I had done that it kind of opened my mind to, well, there's probably a whole bunch of other ways to run stuff.
Well, John, do you remember when you had that kind of revelation?
Go for it, John.
I started gaming back when I was in college, which was many, many years ago at this point. But I wasn't allowed to play when I was a younger kid. My parents wouldn't let me do that. They let me own the books, so I read through them. I looked at them, and I was just itching, to get into this. And so I think I definitely built up a core notion of what that was in like the AD&D second ed days. And then when I played and I had somebody run the game, and the first kind of games went okay, and then the second game that somebody ran for me, I absolutely hated and said I can do this better. And then I realized it wasn't that easy. But then it was kind of like, ooh, there's more to it. Like it was always like there's something else that I can grasp. And then when I started to discover other games, it's like that's so much more fun in this way. And I think one of the things I love is I keep seeing new games that focus on different things. Even if they're a kind of new take on something old, they kind of add a new idea to the field. They do something different that I look at and I say, how can I do that? How can I bring that into whatever I'm currently doing? And so I think, kind of that moment when I moved off of that AD&D second edition thing, as a very young guy looking for something else, and discovered, I don't even remember if it was Shadowrun or Deadlands, but just like, what else is there? This is awesome. This is completely different. This can be more than what I've been exposed to all these years.
Yeah, I think for me, probably the moment, if there was one, was when I decided that I was more game master than player. Throughout my early years, I much preferred playing. And in particular, there was one game master who I'd always gamed with. And when he started to become a bit more unavailable and I decided to take the chair, I used the lessons that, sort of like the adverse stuff. The stuff I didn't like he was doing, I would adapt to my style accordingly. And then I went to play with another group, and I learned that the idea of a campaign having an ending was a completely new thing to me. You created characters, and you played till you got bored, and then you started another campaign. The idea that you were working towards something was sort of a new thing for me. And from that point on, I think that every time that the status quo has changed for me, I've learned something new, and I've had to adapt my style. When we started to get, when my now wife started to play, we started to go more into the role-playing aspects of things, and less worrying about how good we're hunting down the story. There was a point where I used to call myself a spaghetti at the wall game master. I just throw a lot of things at the players, and whatever stuck, that's where we were heading down the road. And then I had another player who showed up and he hated that approach. He's like, how can we have a mystery if how we solve it is just you're going with whatever we're going with? I learned fairly early on that everything's constantly evolving, and you have to change and adapt your style for every group. And what works for one doesn't work for another. I've had fun games where players just role play the hilt. I've had fun games where players are like, we'll just make the diplomacy roll and move on. It's just what works once doesn't necessarily work all the time, and I'm constantly learning.
What was this game system that changed it all for you? What was the one that really launched you into Super GM?
Well, I don't consider myself a Super GM.
Humble.
That is a hard question because
probably GURPS. And the reason why I say GURPS is because that came out around the late 80s or early 90s, and that was really the first game that basically said, and how true it is up for debate, but basically said, whatever you think, here's the rules for it. So that was the first time where my mind was like really open to like, well, I've always wanted to do, I don't know, high seas piracy. Okay, well, we'll do that with these rules. Or, hey, why don't we do a fantasy take on space opera? Well, okay, we just use these source books and move on. I think that was really the first system where I was just like, I can run anything I want as long as I can think of it, rather than what this particular rule set is telling me I can play.
Yeah. Phil, what was the one for you?
I don't know if there's one. There's like different ages of my GMing. Perhaps I'm old enough that there are now like several geological ages of my gaming. But certainly Amber Diceless was a watershed moment for me. Vampire the Masquerade was another one, and then more recently Dungeon World. Dungeon World was a game that kind of blew my mind when I read it and finally understood what was going on. And I should back up. I can't say it's Dungeon World. It was Apocalypse World, and then I ran Dungeon World. So Apocalypse World was really the game that kind of blew my mind, and Dungeon World, being a direct derivative of it, just kind of continued that flow.
Okay. And John?
It's going to sound odd, but and I just kind of realized this, but the one that really kind of changed the way I think about GMing was a free PDF of somebody's just homebrew of a Final Fantasy role-playing game. Because, as a kid, I grew up playing those games, and I loved them. And when I saw this one that was done online, which, I think it was pretty good for what it was like a direct mimicry of that feeling exactly. That was kind of where I said, I could do this. Like when I went from being a player to a GM, like, I could do that just as well as that person is. That was the one that said, you know what, I could do that and make it a free PDF and do something that fits what I want. And then when I think my buddy and I were playing a game and it didn't quite go right, he wasn't quite as familiar with gaming and gaming tropes, it really kind of spurred me to start writing stuff, and us to start writing stuff together. And that was when I really started thinking about what makes this game work in this way, and why does this one work? And okay, let me go look at, Savage Worlds was I think maybe a year away from that point, and then when I discovered Savage Worlds, I'm like, okay, why does that work for that, compared to what it was before Steadlands, and why does this work, in this gaming system? And that, but seeing that PDF online made me feel like the bigger world of gaming was accessible, of making these things was accessible in some way, of like, hey, cool, somebody go have something I made, rather than, yeah, sure, I'm going to do this all at the table with these same, 5 or 6 people every week or so,
Cool. And when you guys started working on your chapters, your sections of Focal Point, what did you subconsciously bring back to your own game tables as you were developing your sections? What did you personally work on of your game as you were working on this area?
For me, it was, the facilitator chapter is all about, working your table. So it was a lot. I think the one that I probably hit home the hardest on when I was writing was the the collaboration part was a big deal because I now play a lot of games that are far more collaborative. So my focus has been on how to get that whole table in a collaborative state working together and things like that. And then the other one, which was an eye-opener for me, was the safety chapter, because that was a chapter I felt like it needed to be in the book. I had my own feelings about the chapter, but I'm nowhere near the experts in the community. So we actually, that chapter was actually pre-read. I don't know if that's a word, but before the book came out, John Stravopoulos, who is actually the inventor of the X card, was nice enough to actually read the chapter and give me a lot of feedback and help me really work that chapter so that it was kind of in line with what the community that really focuses on safety was aligned with. So those were that was very eye-opening for me, because that was one where I was aware of the issues of safety, but kind of like you, Garrett, I game with a lot of friends, and so I never really considered how much safety do I have to worry about at my table, because I kind of know everybody I play with. But once you kind of dig into it and read it, you start wondering, like, well, maybe we should have these talks before we start gaming, or maybe we should set some ground rules just so that no one kind of goes over the line with anyone else at the table.
Yeah, very important. John, what did you learn?
One of the things from my green screens and CGI chapter that was definitely one where I focused on partial areas that I feel strong in, but areas I feel weak in. And there were two things that I remember really thinking about after writing those and thinking about those things and bringing them back to it. And one was the building your body language vocabulary. I wrote a bit about how, as a game master, you're partially an actor to do this, and we very rarely think about what we look like and how we, how our emotions are. And so one of the pieces of advice I read in there is, like, prepare to be embarrassed, sit down in front of a mirror, and make faces at yourself. And that was partially inspired by a Mel Brooks comedy sketch where he has some joke about, like, amusing himself by sticking his tongue out at himself in the mirror every morning. But I'm like, well, how do I actually put on a grumpy face? What does my grumpy face look like? So, sit down in a mirror and you make a grumpy face at yourself and you go, oh, that doesn't look grumpy at all, and you kind of have to do that enough to kind of disassociate the fact that it's you in that mirror and think about what your face is really conveying with that. So that was one of the things I really started to think about a lot after I actually sat down and did that exercise and took pictures, and then thankfully they never got used in the book. But the other one was one of the things that I'm good at is coming up with stuff on the fly. One of the things I'm bad at is describing that stuff in detail in the way that I see it in my head. I don't often have the best grasp of vocabulary when I'm in the zone and let's go, let's move, how are we going to do this? So I talk about writing descriptive terms down, I think the example I have in the book is, like, you want to kind of present a spooky kind of castle. So, beforehand you sit down and write down all the sorts of things, almost like box text, but in a very, I can grab that wherever I want way. And, so you say it's dusty, it's decrepit, it's quiet. But even if there are, like, specific vibes you're going for, like you hear children's songs sung by voices no longer attached to living bodies, echoing and garbled as if coming from far away and being filtered through a pool of fetid water. And just sitting down before you get in the zone, in the movement of the game, and figuring out exactly what would convey that to you. And then people go like, oh, I've used that in games that I've done, and people just kind of stop and go like, oh, God, I didn't, this isn't a Scooby-Doo castle anymore. This is a really dark place,
Very cool. And Phil, Walt, have you guys done that? After reading that, did you get a mirror and start doing that?
I did not. I will have to take John's advice and sit there and make some faces.
Could do it on the C Plus Hangout right now.
Yeah, I'll do McGrumpy. Do the dad face.
My dad face is bewildered.
How did that get that high up the walls?
Walt, did you try that?
No, I'm not I'm still a bad prop guy. I can't help it.
When I read that, John, it brought me back. I was a touring stand-up for 2 years, and that was the advice that my mentors gave me. It was in front of the mirror, even though you hate looking at yourself doing your act over and over, watch yourself in every subtle movement you make. And it took me right back to that.
Yeah, everybody else is going to be looking at it. You might have some idea of what they're seeing.
Cool. Well, what did you develop as you were working on your chapters?
Actually, in a more sort of holistic sense, I was kind of, while I was writing this, I kind of had an epiphany with my own campaign, in that I'm an older guy. My group primarily are also, older guys and an older gal. We have kids. We have other things we're doing. We theoretically play bi-weekly instead of weekly. And there are a lot of missed sessions. And I realized that while we are doing that, and sometimes it could be a month between sessions, we were all kind of playing with this weekly mindset whenever we did get together. And it was just, it was tearing the campaign apart, because, hooking players into a campaign, if there's something going on, how are they going to, you have to recap. I mean, nobody can remember anything from a month ago. And nobody cares to remember anything from a month ago, because their mind's filled with so much other stuff that's far more important than, trying to save the universe or whatever. And I learned really that I started to have to take what I'd been learning from convention games and convention events and sort of apply that more to the home game, and sort of treat each adventure as, treat each session as its own sort of mini convention, where I have a goal in mind, we reach the goal, we move on, and as long as that goal was achieved, I start the next adventure almost like it's its own thing, even though it builds off of what's before. And especially one thing that I'd noticed was our camaraderie was really getting in the way, where we would, not only are we getting together for one session maybe a month, but we all know each other, we order dinner and everything. By the time we get going, it's an hour and a half into the session, and because I'm driving an hour to these sessions, I'm looking at the clock, and I started leaving earlier and earlier, and I'm like, well, wait a minute. I talked to the guys, and I'm like, if we're only meeting once a month or so, we can't be having these sort of 2.5, 3-hour sessions. We've got to bulk it out a little bit more. So we talked about it, and we adapted it, and we're now ensuring that we're playing for at least 4, if not 5 hours a game, and that's what I planned for. So yeah, that was, I think, the realization that I'm getting old, sort of, forced me to sort of take the lessons even more to heart and look at them in a different light, to make sure that we get started at a decent time, that I've got clear goals in mind, that the players are engaged because they're they're enjoying the campaign, not so much because they can remember bulks of information from sessions past.
Very cool. It's an interesting point, Walt. Is there advice in Focal Point, or if there isn't, could you provide some now about running a session with your spouse or significant other as a player at the table?
Ooh, I think that's more Phil than me, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm actually wondering if I'm gonna quick check, because it's been a while since I read my own section, but I feel like there was something about the GM's girlfriend or something.
In your playing company section, you have some stuff about it, I think.
Well, to save Phil for a second so he can go surf that up, I've actually found that the biggest problem with having a spouse or a girlfriend is that you're always perceived as favoring them. And I particularly, in one campaign that I was running with my spouse, who is a gamer, I had a friend who just could not believe that she and I weren't talking and plotting things between sessions, even though we weren't. She's the kind of player who she's got a lot on her mind. She's a professional woman and everything else. Once the game stops, she doesn't really think about it till we get started again. but for the life of me, I could not convince this guy otherwise,
Hmm.
and it was tough. And it's like, but I mean, naturally, you're only going to run games that your spouse is interested in if she's a player. But I mean, that's true of any player at your table. You're not going to run something if somebody in the group just can't stand it. But you always have to be mindful. I mean, there are certain things that you're never going to please everybody 100% of the time. The person at your table that role plays is always going to hog the spotlight more than somebody who's more timid. The person who's really tricked out their character sheet is going to excel when it comes to the fight scenes. I mean, those are just things that you just have to deal with and manage, but you're never going to, you're fooling yourself if you ever think you're going to completely even things. So, I wouldn't try. I mean, I address concerns, and if something really is out of whack, then you deal with it. But, just understand that, and sometimes it helps, too, to just be in their shoes for a moment. Like, my one friend, I could understand where he's coming from, especially if things aren't, that one particular week, things just weren't going for him at the table. The dice were rolling the wrong way, and he was in a bad mood. I think I did talk about that somewhere in there. But you just have to try to be understanding and address the concerns, but you're never going to completely get away from that.
I think you just start by just killing your significant other's player character. Right at like first scene, you just kill her first player character and just be like, see, look, no partiality right there, and just one dead player character.
What's the term you use?
Did you sleep alone that night, Phil?
Yeah.
What's the term you use? Spousal karma?
Spousal karma. I mean, Walt brings up a good point. I think the thing that you have to establish is that when your significant other is playing, they are just a player. There's no privilege. There's no leverage. There's no going easy. And it has to be a two-way street. Your significant other has to understand that when they're playing, they are just another player. And that, the dice fall where they fall, and however that goes. And that's, I mean, easier to say in theory than it is sometimes to do in practice, but I think that makes the table run the smoothest.
Another thing about playing with spouses, because I've encountered this where back in late college, I was dating a girl who, was interested in gaming, had done a lot of it, nerdy in many other ways, and wanted to start GMing. So he said, yeah, cool, all right, I'll walk you through the steps. And then when it came time for her to run for us in the group we were playing with, expected more from me than to just be a player, and it was like, oh, I didn't know you wanted me to co-GM, and she kind of had different ideas of what I was going to do to help move the group along, almost like I was going to be playing the GM PC for her, which would have not necessarily been a bad tactic had we discussed it beforehand, and I knew that was what my expectation was. Instead, I was trying to be very quiet to let her take the spotlight and run the game, because I was the group's core GM before that. I didn't want to jump in and overshadow her, but when it came to floundering, it was like, I have no idea how to help you because you need to maintain some GMing authority, but she wasn't confident enough to just take that at that point,
I think it helps, too, if in your groups, if each character has a clearly defined role and you know what that role is. And whenever something comes up for that particular role, you ensure that nobody else is kind of stepping on that, and that you're, making sure that your adventure touches each of those roles during the course of a session. That goes a long way, rather than, having the character who's got all the social skills out the wazoo getting out-talked by, the warrior next to him because that particular player decided to be talkative that session. So.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to jump in there, but.
John, did you have more?
Nope.
Okay. Next week, I'm starting my first One Ring campaign, and very excited about it. And I've avoided doing the token stuff before because, as I am to Star Wars, Phil, my wife is to token. She didn't know what season it is by which Tolkien book she's reading. And I've always been intimidated by her encyclopedic knowledge of it going into there. How do you have advice in the books about handling that situation of going in where there are people at the table with vast amounts of knowledge going in, and you have kind of a little bit of trepidation on that?
Yeah, so there's a chapter called the Film Crew, which kind of talks about how to source your players and get them to work for you as a GM. So, rather than being intimidated by it, I mean, first you just own it and say, listen, you're clearly the Tolkien master here, so I'm going to do my best. And when there's times where you can add a little depth or a little nugget of history that will kind of add to the game, please feel free to do that. And then just also set that groundwork that I may deviate from canon, or I may not. Like, you may just decide, I'm going to try to play this as strict to canon as possible, so call me out if we look like we're going over the line, or set that expectation yes, it's Tolkien, but we're from this point in history on, we can go in any direction, and we're not bound by what happened in the books past, this particular year. Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty much true for any kind of game where you're playing with an IP that people have varying levels of knowledge.
I think in my own case, I would go to page 107 with the acting like adults section, and basically, one anecdote that I can talk about from my own history was when I went to run a Star Wars campaign. I like Star Wars. I'm a fan, but I never got around to reading very many of the novels, or what they used to call the expanded universe, and this was back before Disney said it was cool to not use that stuff. And so I did two things. One was I told my friends when we sat down and we were going to run this, I said, look, if you guys don't have a problem with this, I'm only considering the movie as canonical. And if it showed up in a movie, then yeah, we're going with that. But otherwise, if I happen to come across something on Wikipedia or something to use or adapt, I will. But I don't want to be called out on every planet in the galaxy or whatever, and what plot threads happened in between Empire and Return of the Jedi, because I just don't know it and don't care to go learn it, because I've got a game to run. And the other thing that I did was, after doing that, I sort of modeled my campaign to take place in a section of the galaxy that I just said, look, this is uncharted area. I'm incorporating it, but none of this stuff showed up in any of the books, and that sort of minimized any problems that players might have had with things. And for the most part, once they understood that, if I brought in an NPC that was from the expanded universe or something, they thought it was cool and played with it, but they didn't call me out on, you deviated from this trilogy or that thing, So
did you include the Christmas special in there?
Of course, that's canonical.
Christmas special.
Just because that was filmed, right? That's legit.
It's just not a cantina scene without B. Arthur belting out a shirt.
One of the reasons that I dislike the old school World of Darkness is solely because my players, when we were playing in those games, all loved it so much and poured through the books and had all these ideas and knew all this stuff. And so when came my turn to run a game and they said, we want to do this, I said, all right, we're going to do 1920s Akron, Ohio. I'm going to try, but no, the bourgeois here are not exactly like that. They're a little more like this. But no, this is how they are. And it's pronounced Bruja. And I'm like, it's whatever I say it is, because I'm the storyteller. But that's hard to do, because especially when there is a big bulk of knowledge there, it's hard to get some of the players who are so in-depth into it to kind of just be like, oh yeah, cool, whatever, that's fine, this is the game we're playing right now, because they come to the table for a particular play experience. Like you mentioned about the One Ring, players come to play a Tolkien-feeling game. They don't come to play D&D in Middle-earth. They come to play a game that feels very Tolkien-ish, and that's one of the reasons why I like running at the One Ring. is because it gives a feel like that, but inevitably you always have that player who knows everything more than you do, and you go, right, that's who that character is, and it was revealed in the Similarian appendices and that this character did this, and I love starting every One Ring game. I won with like, all right, so this is going to be movie accurate, right? That's what I'm going for. So do all the cool cinematic stuff, and there's that one player who just glares at me until
Yeah, if I said that, I'd be sleeping on the couch. The last thing I want to ask about, and reading this book, it really reminded me of last fall when my wife gave me a copy of The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, and it reminded me a lot about how it says that as you grow up through life, through subtle or not so subtle ways, people say things to you that make you put up emotional, mental blocks that keep you from going down certain roads as writers or as performers. But I can even see it so far in GMs. People say the one player who wrote his eyes when you tried to do a voice one time, so you don't do voices anymore. Or you try to build a set using glue and cylinders and paper mache, and somebody snickered, so you don't do it anymore. How do you even acknowledge as a GM that you have these blocks, and how do you use Focal Point to bust those down?
I'd say that's the challenges we include at the end. Would you say that's accurate, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, the challenges were designed to they were designed so that, because you're never going to be able to take Focal Point to the table and look things up while you're playing. Like that we knew that was we knew that was impossible. So what we wanted was a way for you to challenge yourself by taking things from the book and including them in your games. And so the end of each chapter has 6 challenges, things that were pertinent to that chapter that you can pull in and incorporate. And so when you do find yourself weak in an area, like when a chapter hits home with you and you're like, wow, I really, this isn't really my wheelhouse, the challenges kind of give you like a little step-by-step way to get into applying those into your game and kind of bust you out of your comfort zone.
Okay. Well?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is one's an easy one to pile on because, that is what the challenges were designed to do. I mean, I think, in another way, to sort of bring it all back to the beginning, I mean, that's what the 3-pronged approach is all about. I mean, in some cases, it's not just that a game master is particularly weak in an area, it's that they may have particularly steered away from that area for whatever reason. Some game masters don't like to use props. Some game masters just jot down a few notes, or you've got what we used to call the cellophane GMs. That if it wasn't, if they're not running published adventures, then they're not running. And so this book is sort of designed not only to tell you to show you ways to to sort of expand the repertoire, as it were. But I would also hope that the book shows, and just like we did in Odyssey, that it's okay to make mistakes. And oftentimes I learn more from my mistakes than my successes, because it's the mistakes that make you go home and think about, well, geez, how could I have approached that differently? Instead of, I'm never going to do that again. It's usually more of a case where it didn't work this time. How can I make it work next time? Or ask, now in today's world, you've got other game masters you can easily tap or whatever, and books, and then just say, hey, how would you approach this? And sometimes the advice is good, sometimes you use it, sometimes you don't, sometimes you adapt it. And so, I would, like I said, I don't think that somebody's going to pick up Focal Point and completely change how they GM. I'm just hoping that for every person who picks it up, they find maybe 3 or 4 or 5 key points that they're saying, maybe I could add a little bit more of that into my campaigns, and and here's how.
Cool.
John? Yeah, I think Focal Point is a great book for kind of picking up, leafing through, being like, oh, let me see what this is about. Something catches your eye, or you say, I want to read this chapter. It's short, it's bite-sized. I want to see what's there, and then when you get to that challenges section at the end, there's like 6 challenges of different sorts that just say, go try this, go try that. And even if you look at it and you're like, ask a player to tweet a recap. Okay, cool, recaps. no, wait, tweet it. No more than 3 entries or sentences. Oh, well, wait a minute. That's a different, horse of a different color. How do I do that? How do I get them to do that? And I think it's important in we've all got our strengths and weaknesses, but nobody is an expert at everything. So I think it's important in the way it makes you ask questions of yourself, calls back to stuff in the chapter that you can then go easily look and say, oh, I see the example of that, or I see what this is done, but, how Walt says it here, but Phil covers something similar in a slightly different way. They kind of overlap, but looking at them together, there's like 2 views on it. Oh, how do I put myself in there? I think it's very well written with regards to that, of making readers think about how they do the GMing themselves.
Very cool. And how do people get their hands on a copy of Focal Point?
So right now, pre-orders I think are shipping out, which means that very shortly the book will. First, the book will be available on enginepublishing.com, so you can always go there. If you order the book, you'll get the PDF right away, as well as the EPUB, Mobi, raw text. I forget. There's like 6 other ways that that the text is presented. And then very shortly after the pre-orders kind of close out, Engine will put it up for sale on DriveThruRPG. So you'll be able to pick it up there, and I think there's probably 1 or 2 other.
If you are at a convention where Studio 2 Publishing is, Studio 2 Publishing, they go to the bigger ones. Dragon Con, I think, will be the next one I think they'll be at. I think I've seen them there when I've gone there. So you can always pick it up from them in their sections. And I've always been delighted to see books in the Accidental Trilogy at my local gaming stores. And I always ask them, a little bit of pride. They're like, hey, do you have this book? I wrote it. Do you have this book? Can you get this book? And they're like, oh, yeah, hey, we can get those books. So, and I've found gaming stores, you can often ask them, like, hey, I'm really interested in this book, but I want to see it first. Like, would you be willing to order a copy that I can look through? A lot of times a game store owner will be like, yeah, cool. If there is at least one person who has interest in this, there may be others. So I have more data on this being worthwhile on my shelves than I do on, the latest splat book from, Paizo. So, yeah, I will drop the money to order this one.
Yep.
So.
And the book goes with what you call it. Now that it's in the hands of Studio 2, the book is going into distribution pipeline for stores.
Very cool. Well, thank you very much, John Arcadian, Phil Vecchione, and Walt Kanowski. It was great talking to you guys, and congratulations. I'm only 80 pages into the book right now, but I am enjoying it, and we'll be finishing it within 2 days.
Awesome. Thank you.
Very cool. Thank you.